We welcome you to Donnybrook Next Up. Joining us today is former businessman, convicted felon, and now an author, Shaun Hayes. The book is The Gray Choice. Welcome, Mr. Hayes. How are you tonight?
I'm wonderful, Wendy. Thank you for having me.
The booksellers across the nation have racks and racks of books from people who have fallen from great heights. Those books are usually met with cynicism on the part of the public. If there's somebody looking at the book, or somebody who is watching this program tonight and they are cynical about the reason behind the book, or how can somebody change that much, how would you address that cynicism?
Well, I look at it like I had a very successful career for 30 years before I ever committed a crime. And so there's that part of the book. Then there's the part of the book that has a crime in it. And then, as I seek redemption, I'm looking for somebody that's either an entrepreneur and who is aspiring or just starting, and they're going to say, okay, these are things I can do and things I shouldn't do. And then there's the ethical side. We live in a society today where it wasn't that long ago that E&Y paid a $200 million fine for cheating on CPA exams. And yeah, I would say, yeah, cynical would be a good word. My ex-wife is very cynical about it. However, I think when you read it, if I could just help one person, then I've accomplished my goal. And that's what I'm trying to do.
You know, Mr. Hayes, just so the viewers don't get the idea that this was a victimless crime, I mean, the taxpayers were left on the hook for $160 million for the FDIC and another $5 million for TARP. And of course, shareholders of the three banks lost a lot of money, and individuals did it. Your sentencing in 2018, the Assistant U.S. Attorney brought up that some longtime employees of the bank, I think it was Excel, had lost their retirement funds. Somebody went from $156,000 to $1,200. Assuming those people aren't going to be buying your book, but maybe they're watching the show, what message would you have for the people who lost their retirement funds?
Well, of course, I'm sorry and very remorseful. At the same time, and when you put three banks together, but the crime was at one.
The three banks went down that you
right.
were.
And I won't debate that with you, but I will say the two were going down before I got there and had nothing to do with the crime. The Truman Bank and Sun Security, but the one that I committed the crime and the one that I take full responsibility for, Excel, you know, I lost about $10 million there, so I can feel what those sheriffs felt to a large degree. That being said, I feel horrible for what happened, and my crime was one of having had so much success. I thought, well, I'm not taking money, so if I can just do these technical things, which were illegal, unequivocally illegal, can I buy myself time to fix the problem? And I didn't. And so I feel horrible about that. And actually, I got an email from one of the former employees last night through my author website, and it was a tough email in a lot of ways. And it was actually, I think what I would take from it more than anything was it was somewhat of forgiveness in it of, now that I've seen what's happened to you the last, well, in my case, 15 years in my mind, but certainly the last 5 or 6, I can let go of it. And that's what I'm trying to do is make good to people who don't do it again and don't hurt that many people.
But it wasn't just a single crime. I mean, there were a series of like bad loans, friends of Shaun loans, they called them.
Well, but it's concentrated in really in my co-defendant. If you get down to it, and the damage there is horrific, and I pay for that every day, mentally. I pay for it. I pay for it monthly with money, and you know, it's hard, and it's been hardest on my children because my poor decisions, my crime, have affected them, and I went from being Father of the Year in their mind to I have 5, and some don't want to speak to me, and some do, and so I can relate to what I've done to people, and that hurts me at night. Trust me.
Take us back to, as you said, what was so unusual about the crimes that we've all read about. was it was after you sold Allegiant for $500 million.
Right.
Is that intoxicating to the point of, I mean, were you walking the line before the sale of Allegiant, before you were operating in that really rarefied air, or, you know, how did that impact that kind of success, that kind of financial gain? How did that impact your decision making?
That's the question. Two answers to that. The first one is, when you're that successful, Wendy, you think you can do no wrong, and you get to where you don't think the laws apply to you. And as I talk about in the book, and I talk about anybody I talk to when they ask me to speak about ethics, is in the first scenario, we pushed the envelope, but we would go to our attorneys, and we had Thompson Coburn, and we would say, tell us how we can do what we want to do, but it was never illegal. We would go up the line. We did that over and over, because that's what you want to do. You want to maximize the shareholder value, but you don't want to do that. Whenever I'd had that success, and then we didn't talk about the fact that National City failed, who I sold to, and I lost about $20 million very quickly, and that was the beginning of me becoming desperate. And whenever they failed, and I tried to dig myself out of this, I did two things wrong before I committed the crime. One was, the business term would be, I caught a falling knife. I thought I was so invincible and I was so smart that I could fix Truman and Sun Security, and that I could continue doing what I was doing at Excel. I failed at that, but that's part of it. The other part of it is that I didn't have those people around me who we would have those discussions of where is the line, and I didn't have the money to use the attorneys and the accountants that I should have.
Did you have them at one point and dismiss them because you had achieved so much, or what was that?
No, that I got killed in the early 2008. I didn't commit a crime until 2009. I was still at National City when I got killed. The financial crisis that occurred, and you can call it 07, but certainly in the first half of 2008, cost me $10 million a month for a while. And then when it was time to get out of National City, and I say this in the book, I had what I call a guerrilla warfare, ground intelligence mentality. You spend 4 years in a company with 35,000 people, that's a Fortune 200. I lost all that. And then I went back into it, and I'm bleeding over here on one side, and on this side I'm desperate. And I didn't spend the money. I didn't have the people, and that's all on me. That's another thing I'm guilty of. And that's the lesson in that is, surround yourself with good people. And I didn't that time.
Well, but we're seeing that in the political realm, aren't we? We're seeing that people keep their own counsel with disastrous consequences. So you're, on this episode of Next Up, you're really talking to potential Shaun Hayeses out there, aren't you?
Absolutely, and they're everywhere. I want to, in the very beginning of the book, I tell a story. In the first month of my banking career, my career out of college, we took a test, and they had a room full of management trainees, and the first question was, have you stolen anything from this company? And I answered it no, and I said, and the question really resonated. Why are they asking me this? 3 weeks into my career. So I raised my hand, and it was a large company out of Chicago that was testing this, and the gentleman came on. I said, sir, and he looked at me, he said, you've answered that incorrectly. And I said, how could I? I literally haven't taken anything home. And he said, you will. And what we do is, and this in political, to me, is where we all see it in the most public form. But if you go to business, you take a pencil, you take a pad of paper. When I was a young management trainee, a guy set me up on a blind date, and we went to a Royals baseball game, and it came time to pay, and I put out $90 because I had this date, and it was dinner and all that, and I saw him put his company credit card out there. He took my $90. And it's those little steps, and the analogy that I draw is, I had never flown a plane, but a few years ago I was with a friend, and we go on business, and we go out all the time, and one day he said, you have to know how to do this. I always had to sit in the passenger seat, and so I flew it, and I was terrified for a lot of reasons that the book will tell you. But after about a few minutes, he said, Shaun, I need to take over. Well, I was the most relieved man in the world. He goes, do you understand in another 5 minutes they would have scrambled F-15s from Lambert because you would have been over Fort Leonard Wood. The point was speed, time, and distance. You leave L.A., going to D.C., you end up in New York. That's what happens to me. That's what happens. It's not an excuse, it's a fact. And that's what happens in politics.
Well, I along with that, one of the quotes that your publicist had from the book jumped out at me when you say, I have no reason to look down on anyone anymore. My journey has forever changed me. Anybody who thinks they're somehow better, more principled, or more virtuous is lying to themselves. And I know people who are honest, Mr. Hayes. I know people who, if they found a purse on the street, they'd return it to the owner, let alone, you know, steal something. And I mean, do you not know any honest people? I mean, when you say that anybody who thinks that they're somehow better, more principled, or more virtuous is lying to themselves, do you know?
I'll take you to the Bible. Are you without sin? We all are. Well, you made the analogy of sin.
Well, I know people who I consider principled and virtuous enough that they would not get involved in bank fraud. They would not have $160 million having to go to FDIC.
No, and I know, and I would say I know some of the same people, but I know they also speed. I know maybe they drink too much, maybe they do, but we're looking at degrees.
Same thing that they're...
No, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but there's a study from a Stanford professor in the early 70s, and he said the summation of it is, given the right set of circumstances, any person can commit any crime. And you think about that long enough, and I've read you for 40 years, and I know that you will see that there. And what it is that I did something horrible, but that's no different than me. I don't speed anymore. I use cruise control, but it's the same principle.
But
it's a step at a time.
Okay, when are you?
But when it comes to learning the lesson, and we understand that, as you said, planks and splinters. We're always so quick to point out the splinter in somebody else's eye without recognizing the plank in our own eye. But it does sound like you are offering it as an explanation of these misdeeds. And I have to ask, just out of curiosity, when it came time to release you from prison, you were released because of COVID, and I thought you were released because of COVID.
Not. I didn't get out, and that's the Post, and you're in the business.
Sure.
To me, never was I ever asked a question by the Post. I didn't get out of prison 1 millisecond early for COVID. The only benefit I got from COVID was I didn't have to stay in the halfway house. But I knew on July 26, 2019, I was getting out on May 5th, 2020.
But you were found to be in violation of your probation. Can you explain to our viewers what that was about?
Okay.
You did serve an additional 30 days, correct?
Absolutely. And it's about two things, and that's what drove me, that's why the book finishes the way it does. The first thing is I had 24 violations. 20 of them were when you're in prison, and you go through, especially what I've gone through, but virtually every man or woman that goes through has it, you have credit issues. So they tell you to come out and put up cash and get a credit card. I had 3 of those. That's a violation under my term. And every time I charge something, that's a violation, even though it's really no different than a debit card to me. If you have a bank account and the money's in it and you use it, but that's a violation. I'm violent, and I did not deny that I didn't do it. That's 20 of the 24. 4 of them, absolutely. And what they were...
The adult daycare center.
No, that is...
Oh, I thought those were...
No.
Okay.
No, that has nothing to do with any of that. What the other thing, and now that you mentioned, I want to go to another technical one. If you call me and left me a voicemail, which my prior employer's place, and I collected a lot of money in my life, and you get a phone number and someone owes you money, you call anybody that you've got their phone number trying to collect it. Well, someone had left a voicemail saying, I need my money. Well, they didn't say whose money it was. Well, it sounds like I owed someone money. I didn't. But let's talk about the 4 I'm guilty of, and I don't deny that, is when I was in prison, I'd started a business. That's not an uncommon thing. You all may look at that, but there are people behind bars running prisons every day. I never had a cell phone, but I was in a camp with 200 men, and there were 400 cell phones. And so that was in a violation. That's the kind I did. The other 20 were literally you using your debit card. I mean, if you read, and I haven't done this since then because I've learned my lesson, if I want to use a credit card that's in my wallet, I have to call my probation officer. That's how strict the rules are.
Okay. Let me return one last time to the quote about anybody who thinks they're more virtuous, more principled, is lying to themselves. In 2014, when you were arrested at Plaza Frontenac for the failure to pay child support, and you were $91,000 in arrear, and at the time you were living in a 6-bedroom home in Ladue on Fordyce Lane. And the judge said that you used subterfuge to avoid paying your child support by putting $283,000 in an account without your name on it. And I think about all the friends I've had who've gotten divorced and have willingly paid their child support because it was the right thing to do. I mean, shouldn't a fellow like that be justified in thinking he's more virtuous than you, Mr. Hayes?
Okay. Well, yes, he should. But let me give you some facts that weren't discussed. The first thing is I think they're thinking about $293,000 in a business account. That's number one. Number two is there hadn't been a house payment on my house in Ladue made for over 3 years at that point. Just so you know, I went almost 5 years without making a payment. Number three is when I first got divorced, I didn't have any child support requirement. And I paid several $1 million. And I won't go into the facts and circumstances behind the divorce. It's amazing how I got the majority of the custody. If you really looked into the facts and you'd say, wait a minute, what happened was in 2011 when I didn't have the money for a lawyer, I allowed them to call college payments child support. Up until that point, I'd paid my money all on, but that gave them the leverage of being able to incarcerate me. My lawyer was not a divorce lawyer. He didn't know any different. I'm not blaming him. I would have still done it anyway. The point was, when we did that in 11, I was limping along, and I was just trying to pay it. So there's, not that makes me right, but we're on this scale of virtue. Well, it isn't out here where you accuse it is, and it's certainly not over here. I'm not saying that. But again, whenever things are written in the paper that you have spent your career at, it helps to talk to both sides.
Right. Well, the reporter who wrote that story did talk to the judge, Judge Beach, who's the fellow who put you in jail.
And by the way, you also said Frontenac banker in that article. I've never lived an hour in Frontenac in my life.
No. You were arrested at Frontenac Plaza.
Police.
No, the article headline is Frontenac banker. If you look, but I was also in the Panera. Just so you.
Okay, well, you were at Frontenac Plaza.
Right, but I wasn't Frontenac banker. And that file, it's on the internet. That's the one thing that comes up when you Google me. And I've always I'm like, I never lived in Frontenac for an hour in my life.
You were living on Fordyce Lane at the time. That's Ladue, right?
Yeah, but it's not Frontenac. It's
Well,
technical.
But the mugshot was a Frontenac police mugshot.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that probably accounts for some of the confusion. When it comes to the proceeds of the book, what are you going to do with the proceeds of the book?
I don't expect there will be proceeds. 250 copies is what most nonfiction sell, 95% if you look at the statistics. And I have way more money in it. What I hope happens out of it is that I end up, my speaking career gets better, and I pay restitution every month. And I pay back creditors, and I pay state income taxes, and I pay federal income taxes that are back. If you went down the list with me, you'd sit there and say, wow. And all of a sudden you'd say, I'm more than having chased debtors before. I pay a higher percentage than any human I've ever seen has to pay. And I'm not complaining. I did it to myself.
Right,
But you kind of sound like you're complaining.
Well,
no, I'm just
the restitution does sound a little bit. I mean, they hit you for $5 million restitution, right?
Right.
I mean,
But in light of $160 million to the FDIC, that doesn't seem too excessive, does it?
I'm not complaining about the $5 million. I wouldn't debate that, and I never have.
Right.
Yeah, I don't debate that. I don't. But the state of Missouri gets 25% because they can do that. Because I live alone. The federal government, the IRS gets 10%, and the federal government gets 10%. And then I pay income taxes before you get to that. And I'm not complaining. I'm just, again, trying to be, upfront and honest. You ask a question.
Right, exactly. And we do appreciate that. We appreciate that honesty. When it comes to the speaker's circuit, there are a lot of people out there who are going to meet you with hostility. Are you ready for that?
Yeah, I've had that all my life. I've been the underdog all my life. I expect it.
Did some of this start in Thayer, Missouri, when you were young, or I mean, was it? I mean, I'm not trying to play armchair therapist here, but every criminal has a story about where the seeds are sown and how they want to succeed and how they go about doing that.
You know, I mean, I was the everything in athletics and class president, student body, all those things. No, and I was never arrested in my life. The first time I was ever arrested in my life was in Frontenac.
Okay.
And so it truly, you know, if you have to point to a point, and I have to look at when I had suffered such a horrific loss and I became desperate, and that goes back to the Stanford study, when you get to a certain situation, people will do things you didn't think you would do. And I'm certainly that. I'm not trying to justify it. It's a fact. And, but
Well,
you know,
what advice could you give someone if it's sort of a predetermined fact that under stress people are going to break? What would be your advice to somebody who finds himself under stress?
And I say you have to surround yourself with people who will hold you accountable. The people that are out there on this virtuous side, where I thought I was that virtuous at one point, if you have those people around you, what is it they say? You're only as intelligent as the five people you hang with is your level of intelligence. You want to get 5 people around you that are more virtuous, that are equally or more, hopefully more intelligent, and you want to use them. And when I first started, and a lot of my success, I say, was driven by banking laws, because you have to have those kind of things. And I was, you know, we were the first. We had women and minorities on our board 30-some years ago when no one else even talked like that. And those things are good things. When you get to the end, and it was you mentioned politicians earlier, I'm picking my friends. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference between when you're here and then when you get over here and you're desperate. Well, I sure don't want Bill to look because he might be critical. But I've known Wendy for 30 years. She may not look as hard. And those are the kind of, those little decisions. And that's what I say. I use the plane analogy because when I had my back against the wall, I started making decision after decision after decision that inevitably were going to lead where they led. But as you're making them, you're thinking, well, this one won't get me there. And in their individual nature, they won't. But in their entirety, I didn't just get there. I went way over there, as you stated numerically.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's your target audience for the speaking, Mr. Hayes? Like, what kind of groups do you hope to address?
Well, I think it's to the entrepreneurial market, and that's where really most men and women, and when they start, are by themselves, or there's 1 or 2 of them. And so there's that market. And the other one is in the large corporate world, it's the ethics problem, and it's everywhere. And a day doesn't go by, if you read the Wall Street Journal close enough, that there isn't something there. I was in prison in Marion with a man who I'd read about for years before I was ever indicted on a KPMG tax fraud. And, it took down dozens of people for hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes. And you sit there and you look at that, and that's a big company thing. So I think it's the small end and the large end. It's not the middle, because the middle, it's a different world. You don't spend money for things like that. You don't have those issues, but it's the 2 extremes.
If you're talking to somebody who is on the verge of making one of those decisions out of desperation, what would you say to that person? I
would say the consequences of failure are far less than the consequence of committing a crime. And that was what I couldn't get. I'd had all that success, as you mentioned earlier, and the sheer fact that I was going to fail, I was failing, I was going to have to admit it, I just couldn't do. If I could redo anything, and I'm one of those people who wouldn't change anything in life because I wouldn't be able to communicate that now, and there's a reason why I'm supposed to, but I would have been much better off failing. What has the toughest part been, Mr. Hayes, your children? My children, that's always the only thing that matters. That's the only thing that matters.
Now, the people I know who've been to federal prison and get out, they say that the really hard thing is trying to find a job afterwards, and that they have to do something entrepreneurial because nobody will hire them. Now, what have you found? I mean, you did have a very successful career before you went off the rails. Right. Have employers been willing to talk to you?
Well, I'm smiling because when you read in the book, and this is, and I'll say the name because I'm always blunt, I interviewed at BJC to make beds, okay? And the reason why I wanted that job was I could do it from 2 to 9, and I could focus on this in the morning because I'm a morning person. Right. And I told him I was a felon, and it wasn't a problem until I went to the HR, and then no one would call me back after that, okay? So obviously it's because I'm a felon, but you can't make a bed in a hospital. So I went to SSM because the other reason I've had some horrible health issues, I spent the last year trying to die, and I failed. And that's actually when I had the time to write the book because I didn't get out of bed for weeks and weeks. But I went to SSM, and they had a job taking bodies to the morgue, which didn't bother me. And they were the most excited people. But they at least, their HR people at least called me back and said, you know, you told us you're a felon, we ran into you, we can't have you here because you're a felon. So it's unbelievably hard. And that's the saddest part of prison is there is nothing there that I saw, but for one thing that I want to speak about, that is about rehabilitation or making or giving you a chance. I taught GEDs in Marion for 8 months to men 40 and 50 years old who'd never had a job that got a W-2. We never gave them the test. And that's it. I did go through a program called RDAP. It gets you a year off. That's why I got out earlier. That was the only, it ought to be taught in every middle school in America. It's cognitive behavioral thinking. It's a really good program. Other than that, they don't do anything for you, Bill.
We are out of time. We appreciate you being here tonight. The book is The Great Choice. The author is Shaun Hayes. The book is available on Amazon. Again, we thank you, and any other questions will have to be answered on the speaker circuit. Thank you all for watching Donnybrook Your Turn and Donnybrook Next Up. We'll see you next week.
Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9PBS.